Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I am back in America for all the excitement. And when there's excitement in the air, married to the topic of Iran, there's just really no avoiding having a friend of the podcast, Ken, and friend of the host, Ken Pollack, back on. Ken was my former colleague at the American Enterprise Institute until he betrayed us and all who used to respect him by becoming the vice president for policy at the Middle East Institute. Previously, as I said, he was at AEI, where he worked on Middle Eastern political military affairs, particularly focusing on Iran, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, all that stuff. And there may have been some three-letter agencies in his past. So, author of many books, yada, yada, yada. Ken, we're sort of in the Japanese curse zone for you, right? Interesting times.
Yeah, tell me about it. It's been a little busier than usual, but I think we all saw this coming. Not quite in the way that it happened, but interesting times.
Let's put aside for just 2 seconds the fact we should tell people we're recording this on Tuesday morning, late in the morning, because things can change really quickly, and all that. By my rough count, don't hold me to the exact number, we've got somewhere between 4 and 45 million different explanations about why the administration did this, the way it did it, when it did it, how it did it, yada, yada, yada. So we can talk about the politics of that in a little bit, but why don't we just sort of start with, let's say a friend of yours, a very smart friend who's up to speed on politics in the region and all that kind of stuff, but has been in a coma for 4 days. How do you brief him on this? Just what do you think are the most salient, important points that we can build from there?
Sure. So let's start here. We can certainly talk about why President Trump made the decision to go to war. But let's just start with the fact that the United States and Israel have attacked Iran. We've proclaimed goals about changing the regime. And we're certainly making some effort militarily to change the regime, but we're not quite doing the full Monty here, right? There's a lot of other things. If you were absolutely determined to overturn the regime, there's a lot of other things that we would be doing, and we're not doing those things. So it's a little bit of regime change light. And one of the big issues out there is that I think the Iranians were surprised by that. Like most of the world, I think the Iranians expected that the U.S. might very well launch a military operation against Iran, but that it would really be a coercive campaign designed to put pressure on them to accede to President Trump's latest demands on nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, the deal that he had been talking about and negotiating with the Iranians. So the expectation was that there'd be a military operation, but it would really be designed to gain him leverage in these negotiations, right? Instead, he did something different, right? At the very least, killing Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, taking out much of the other leadership, that was huge, and then proclaiming that the goal is regime change. And again, the administration, they make all kinds of claims, so it's not a clean claim, but they've mostly been saying this is about regime change. That's really, really big. And the place where it's biggest, of course, is in Iran. Right. And what's really important and that we should talk about is that the way that Iran was expected to respond to what they expected, right, limited military operations designed to gain the U.S. leverage in the negotiations, is entirely different from how they were expected to respond if the U.S. was actually coming for regime change. And what we've seen in the last 3 days was the initial Iranian response was the response that they had planned for that limited American and Israeli military operation. But they were caught completely by surprise. And now what we're seeing is they are shifting over to the kind of response that we were expecting from them when we came for regime change. And it is a much bigger response, and it is potentially much more dangerous.
So I keep, just for my own edification, I keep hearing people say that you can't do regime change from the air. But I also hear people say, sometimes the same people say you can't do regime change from the air. And then they say, well, you can because we did it in Libya, but without ground forces, it was chaos, right? Which is, I think, fair. Or we did it in in Serbia, in the Balkans, but we also then put a security stabilizing force in. Um, Air power has really only been a thing for so long, so it's not like we have to go to the Peloponnesian War and say, was it possible then, right? But
But
what do you?
I'm glad to.
I know. I was going to do a whole counter programming thing and just talk to you about British naval history and really piss people off. But what is the actual, in your opinion, like, is regime change from the air? It's not like an iron law of history or anything like that, but just like the weight of evidence of history says it's probably pretty freaking hard.
Yeah. So there are two different sets of things here we should talk about, and we should talk about each of them. So first, there is the regime change piece, right? Can you overthrow a regime from the air? And we should recognize people have been trying to do that for 85 years, right? In World War II, to some extent, the Germans, certainly the British, were absolutely trying to do that. It's this Italian theorist named Giulio Due. He first came up with this idea, right? And people have been trying to do it ever since. And as you point out, the history is it's really, really hard to do. And in particular, and you made this point, it's really hard to do without a ground force of some kind. So you brought up Libya, which Libya is the most important example, but it's worth remembering, even in Libya, there was a ground force. It just wasn't a NATO ground force. The air forces were NATO air forces. The ground force was a huge Libyan popular uprising in which, by the way, lots of Libyan soldiers joined, right? But that was a ground force. And that's important because that forces the regime to deploy its military forces, which then makes them susceptible to attack, right? If you look at Iran right now, the US and Israel are bombing lots of targets that you would associate with regime change. So headquarters of the Basij, the Revolutionary Guard, the Law Enforcement Command, garrisons, depots, etc. But in many cases, these are empty facilities, right? The people aren't necessarily in them. And at the end of the day, you have to either kill or terrify the people to break the regime's ability to suppress the people. So this is actually something that we really haven't tried to do. There's one interesting example out there, one interesting analogy that we can reach back to, and that was in 1998. I know that you are old enough to remember this. Maybe some of our listeners are too. 1998, the U.S. mounted an operation against Iraq called Operation Desert Fox. The truth is, this is the Clinton administration just kind of, we had to bomb because we had to bomb, right? Saddam threw out the inspectors. We had been saying the longest time, you got to bomb something, but they didn't really have any objectives. So they let our then CENTCOM commander, Tony Zinni, decide on what the hell to bomb. And Tony came up with this really interesting target set of, let me go after the regime's internal security forces. And what was interesting was it did panic Saddam. It absolutely panicked the regime. They did all kinds of stupid things that they shouldn't have, that actually destabilized the regime. So that's the one real example out there where you literally had nothing on the ground to bring out the regime's security forces that would then enable you to strike them, which is what we did in Libya. Okay, so that's the actual, can you overturn a regime? And the answer is, there really aren't any historical examples of doing that without some kind of a ground force. And again, first, that's a Freudian slip. The Trump administration has told the Iranian people to stay in their homes, right? Don't come out into the streets. So we haven't got that. The other side of it is the day after question of, okay, you've now toppled the regime. Now what happens? And there, the history is in many ways even clearer, that if you topple a regime by force and do nothing to replace it, you are likely to get chaos. Right. So, here it's not just Libya is a great example where, again, the Obama administration, bizarrely, right? This is 2011. The Obama administration, which is so determined to learn the lessons of Iraq, repeats the lessons of Iraq in Libya, brings down the Gaddafi regime, does absolutely nothing to replace it. But again, Iraq is another example of that. We actually bring ground forces into Iraq, topple Saddam's regime. We don't bring enough ground forces, and of even greater importance, we don't try to secure the country. And so in both Libya and Iraq, we drive the country into civil war. As you pointed out, Bosnia, Kosovo, these are examples where the US did use military force, bring down the regime, change the regime. Kosovo's, neither is a perfect example, but in both cases, it's close enough. But we bring in ground forces afterwards that secure the population, and that works very well. Right. And so this is the great issue with Iran is all Trump is talking about right now is bringing down the regime. There's nothing out there to suggest that he's planning to occupy the country or deploy any forces to stabilize it afterwards. There seems to be a hope that the Iranian people are going to rise up, overthrow the dictatorial regime, this awful regime, and establish democracy. And is that possible? It's possible, but the historical the historical patterns suggest that's going to be hard and unlikely.
So I have, my cognitive dissonance, my sort of on the one, I'm on a one hand on the other hand guy with this whole thing. I don't like the way it was done. I really wanted to succeed. I was in favor of regime change if done right. If this ends up being done right, then I will give credit for having done it right, even at least on an international stage. But I still think there's just no way a republic goes to war. I mean, I could go on and on all day about there are potential. There are good aspects of this. There are really bad aspects of this. How I'm still sort of working through how to balance the equation of it all. That said, it seems to me that one of the things that makes, as you say, there are not a lot of great precedents to figure out what's next here, right? And so you'll hear people say, well, this is going to be like Iraq. Well, part of the problem, one of the reasons why it's not going to be like Iraq, it might be as bad as Iraq, but for different reasons. But one of the reasons why it's not going to be as bad as Iraq is that you don't have Iran meddling in the same way that you had with Iraq, right? I mean, people forget that Iran really messed with the U.S. in Iraq, and there's no one in the region who's going to be playing that role in Iran necessarily. Also, the population in Iran, at least the cliche now or conventional wisdom from smart people, is much more sort of naturally pro-Western. And the thing I have a hard time figuring out is, I think that one of the things, I've often said that one of the greatest intelligence failures we had about Iraq wasn't the WMD stuff, however people want to score that. It was our complete failure to appreciate how enervated and hollowed out Iraqi civil society had been under Saddam, and that therefore it was very difficult to stand up a society because if you don't have institutions that serve as tent poles for a society. Iran seems like it still has something like a real civil society, or at least from my point of view. So let's just assume that it does, that Trump doesn't decide to just bug out, which I think is entirely possible. And there are moments where I think it's almost likely. But let's say he sees it through for another few weeks. The regime is essentially gone. Maybe there's some pockets of resistance. How conducive an environment is Iran to standing up a new government? I mean, let's put it this way. If you took out Macron in France would stand up another government pretty quickly. I mean, they have new republics every now and then, but they'd be pretty good at it. Is Iran more like Libya and Iraq, or is it more like, a more cohesive, developed society?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think a good analogy would be something like, is it more like Poland in 1989, right?
Right.
And we'll do that. And okay, first, got to admit, we don't know, right? Because we've not had access to Iran the way that we would have liked to for 46 years, 47 years at this point in time. They're clearly, Iran is ultimately the descendants of one of the great civilizations of the world. And you're right, there does seem to be a more vibrant civil society. But we should also remember that there are a lot of institutions, many of which were tainted by this regime.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that the most important institutions over the last 47 years have been institutions either created by this regime or deformed by this regime. And you never know whether they're going to survive or not. You never know how the people are going to respond. In addition, what we've typically found is that how the regime collapses is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get one of these Hobbesian states of nature opening up, which is exactly what happened in Iraq, despite the fact that we had 170,000 troops there because we just let it happen, or Libya, where we didn't have that. People tend to behave the same way, right? Hobbes got it exactly right. In the state of nature, people behave in the worst way imaginable, and life is nasty, brutish, and short, right? And we've seen that very, very consistently with these situations where a power vacuum opens up and people are forced to, Maslow's hierarchy of needs immediately gets reduced to the number one need of, I need security. Right? And people do very bad things under those circumstances, and institutions don't survive under those circumstances. Right? So there's a question mark around just how stable, how strong Iran and its institutions are. There's also a question mark around what the collapse looks like. Right? If you get, and again, we can talk about various scenarios here, but the Iranian regime, put it this way, Iranian politics are incredibly fragmented, and they always have. One of the great Persianists of the last century, a guy by the name of Rui Ramazani, had this wonderful line that I always quote. He said, Iranian politics are like a kaleidoscope, comprised of 1,000 little pieces of glass, and every time you turn the kaleidoscope, every time you change the subject, the issue, they all line up completely differently. So what I'm making here is there are lots of people, even within this regime, who are much more moderate, who are much less anti-West, maybe even pro-West, much more responsive to their people, who actually, might be very good leaders of a new Iranian system. Whether they will survive, big question mark. Whether they will be seen as tainted by the people, big question mark. I mean, again, think back to some of the revolutions where, anyone associated with the ancien regime is, automatically a criminal and, gets guillotined. And you lose all of that talent, and you lose all of the wisdom, and you lose all the leadership there. How the regime goes down will be a very important element of what could potentially come next.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, just on that point, it's not a big deal, but I just think it's really interesting. I've seen chatter about this from Israel and other places, that the regime members who haven't been killed because they've been working with Mossad. And I'm sure that's exaggerated. I'm sure it's correct in some cases. I'm sure it's wrong in other cases. It's not a binary thing. But you can imagine this question of how the regime collapses and what replaces it. Whether or not you worked with Mossad could be a reason you get the guillotine, or it could be a reason why you get a nice portfolio in government. And I have no idea, which it would be. I want to get back to Israel in a second, but first, we talked about this a bit the last time you were on. Iran's only 61%, according to Mr. Google, Persian, and the rest is like 10% Kurds and the Balaks, and I don't know how to pronounce all these guys, but Azeris. How worried are you about a Balkanization thing? Right? Are we going to have the equivalent of a Kosovo, of a Bosnia and a greater, Persian Serbia surrounded by a whole bunch of sort of smaller ethno states? Is there a reason to think that might happen?
Yeah. So yes, entirely possible. And look, I think broadly speaking, you can think about what happens in three different ways. What happens after this in three different ways? And these are families of scenarios. So one is the current regime simply survives, right?
Right.
It rides it out. A second one is that, yes, the regime is overthrown and we get some transition, a Poland kind of a scenario, to a much better government, right? And look, that would obviously be the ideal. That's what we're all hoping for. And the third one is chaos of some kind, right? And, chaos can take many forms, but what you're describing does strike me as some of the most likely sets of scenarios. As you point out, there are all these ethnic groups. Yeah, you're right. You and I were talking about this last time because I was talking about how to do regime change in a smart way and
Right.
talking about making contact with these other groups who mostly hate the Persians. They will almost certainly try to break away. Worth knowing, in after the First World War, Iran fell into a similar state of chaos. And that's exactly what happened. The Kurds, the Baluch, the Arabs, right, they all tried to set up separate governments. Worth noting, after World War II, the Russians, Stalin, tried to pull the Kurds away, pull the Azeris away, kind of recognizing that these were people who were looking to secede ultimately. And so you could easily see another scenario where, yes, they decide to go their own way, and you get a fight in the center, and you could have a civil war. You could have a civil war for years, for decades, or you could have a civil war that gets ended the way that it got ended after World War I, which was a strongman emerged again with enough military power to go and reconquer things, right? That was the last Shah's father, a guy by the name of Reza Pahlavi, who's called Reza Shah, and he was the commander of the Cossack Brigade, which was the most powerful unit arguably in the Iranian military. And you can imagine who backed the Cossack Brigade of the Iranian military. But he basically kind of goes around, he kind of consolidates power in the center and then uses that to go around and crush all of these rival groups, including going and crushing the military forces of all of these seceding ethnic groups, right? All these groups are trying to secede from what had then been Persia, and Reza Shah, by force, brings them back into Iran. And that's another scenario that could happen in Iran, right? And again, very hard to know. And a big issue out there, kind of getting back to the very first question you had is, look, bringing down this regime, that is a positive good. This is an odious regime. They are, horrible, dictatorial, cruel to their people. Last month they killed somewhere between thousands and tens of thousands of their own people. Right? They've immiserated and impoverished a great nation. They are and of course they are deeply anti-American, anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic, anti-Arab. You name it. This is a horrible regime. The world, the Middle East, Iran will all be better off without it. But this question of the day after is really important, again, remembering both Iraq and Libya, because the question becomes, are you simply replacing one set of problems with a different set of problems, right? Again, Saddam Hussein, one of the worst totalitarian tyrants of the 20th century. Again, getting rid of his regime was both a moral and strategic good for the world and for the United States. But then creating a civil war in Iraq, arguably we created as many problems as we solved.
So, just a quick question before we get back to the U.S. part and the Israel part. I kind of like you try to think about all the not even worst case scenarios, just like bad scenarios, right? That can come out of this. The good ones, it's sort of like the whole thing about all happy families are alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. All the best case scenarios kind of just all look the same, but all the number of bad scenarios is sort of infinite. I do wonder, if you talk about, okay, so here is this would-be hegemon in the Islamic world, non-Arab, that wants to assert dominance and all of that being taken off the board. Is it crazy of me to think that Erdogan and Turkey would see this as an opportunity to, first of all, do something about Iranian Kurds, because the Turks got a thing about Kurds, but to sort of wade further in as sort of being Muslim Brotherhood is bad, and in many ways Hamas and all those guys are really offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, but like the family resemblance is a little less in Turkey. But is that something that you think is a serious possibility to worry about, or just something that might be in the cards going forward? Because the more every time I pay attention to what Erdogan has to say about the Middle East, I do not like it.
Yeah, well, he's a very unlikable guy for Americans, truth be told. Look, I think that Erdogan in particular is one of these guys who, at one level, would love to see the Islamic Republic gone because they are, you know, very problematic. It's competition for Turkey. In addition, they are, yes, Shia fundamentalist. He is much
Right.
more Sunni fundamentalist. In addition, the Islamic Republic is just a nasty group of people, and they have supported Kurdish terrorists against Turkey, right? They have backed the PKK against Turkey. I promise you, Erdogan has not forgotten any of that. That said, I think that if you could, sit down and talk with him, I think you'd find that he's also concerned. He is very concerned about the day after. I think he is very concerned about civil war and chaos in Iran because, we've seen the history is very clear on this. Civil wars don't stay contained within their borders.
Right.
They spill over. And remember, Erdogan just got done with, 14 years of civil war in Syria, which was enormously problematic for Turkey because of the refugees and the terrorism and the radicalization and the economic problems that they cause. Right, these are the kind of classic forms of spillover that you see out there. He had to deal with all of them from Syria, and Syria is a hell of a lot smaller than Iran. Plus, as you point out, Iran has a very vibrant Kurdish community, and he is no doubt worried that the Kurds will, as you and I were just talking about, see this as an opportunity to secede and declare independence, right? Which, he sees as anathema. So, again, there's upside and downside for somebody like Erdogan, for a country like Turkey in this.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I think about it is in these terms is, look, Turkey's nowhere near as bad an actor as Iran, right? That's not saying a lot. It's not quite best gas station sushi in Alabama, but it's and Turkey's a different country. I get it, all that kind of stuff. But it does seem like Erdogan has decided to make a pivot to the Middle East and away from Europe, in part because Europe has kind of spurned Turkey. I get it. It's a long story. Having a more militantly Islamist member of NATO is a, I don't want to say it's a bigger problem than the problem posed by Iran, but it is a qualitatively different problem than one we have planned for, or that we know, like we have off the shelf arguments about. And that's the only reason I worry, because I'm very worried about the future of NATO. And you could see this weird bank shot effect of Turkey saying, okay, here's our shot. We're going to be this kind of power instead of trying to be buddy with Europeans. And just the chessboard gets really weird really quickly. But maybe I'm just, speculating too much.
Well, look, again, I think that when this is done, there is a very good chance that the Middle Eastern chessboard is going to get rearranged.
Yeah.
In some ways it already has. And you and I have talked about this a little bit in the last episode where, the big issue for so many Middle Eastern countries in the last few years has actually been the simultaneous downgrading of Iranian power and the rise of Israeli power.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Again, you can always say that Israeli power was there, was latent, but the demonstration of it and Israel's willing to use it, that's been a fundamental change. And again, Erdogan, not a nice man, but that's been a very big issue for him as well, is, he's clearly very frightened about how powerful Israel has now demonstrated itself to be and how willing they are to use their power. With Iran, again, good that they've been reduced from a Turkish perspective, from the perspective of pretty much everybody, but the Iranian regime. But that power vacuum too, creates all kinds of question marks and opportunities. Who's going to fill it? And of course, again, this issue of if Iran is not just weakened, but if the regime collapses, right, that creates all kinds of issues for all kinds of people. I mean, again, it's also kind of interesting, listening as best we can to folks from Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, where, get very mixed messages, right? Different countries, different people have different views. Some are very gung-ho in favor of this. Others, a much more mixed message, because again, on the one hand, they'd love to be rid of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But on the other hand, they're very concerned about what comes next. And there, for instance, with various Saudis I've spoken to, what you get is simultaneously we don't want chaos. Chaos could be really problematic for us. Don't want a civil war, and we don't see you guys being willing to do anything to prevent that. But we also want to make sure that you finish this regime off.
Yeah.
Right? One of the things they also don't necessarily want is an Islamic Republic that's been badly beaten up and really pissed off, but not gone. Right. And that will rebuild itself in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And who knows what the U.S. will be up to and interested in doing at that point in time. But they'll still be there, still facing that pissed off rebuilt Iran.
Yeah. So I just wrote about this in my LA Times column. It'll be up at the Dispatch tomorrow. There are a bunch of things I want to get to, but like one of my great peeves, like we've talked about, another one of my peeves is how realism is just, the best working definition for realism is an ideologue who lost an argument. But another one is this idea that blowback, right, or careful what you wish for, all these kind of like truisms only apply to America or to the West rather than being universal truisms. And, there is this idea, that we've gotten for a long time. Oh, if you do X or Y in the Middle East, you're playing right into their hands. This is what they want you to do. And you're going to reap what you sow, and yada, yada, yada. And sometimes there's some truth to it, or at least it's something to worry about. And sometimes it's utter nonsense, but it's sort of like, you never hear people say, give peace a chance to the Iranians, right? You never see people say, give peace a chance to Saddam. Gandhi was like, give peace a chance to the Brits, lay down your weapons and surrender. You never said to Hitler, violence never solved anything, right? So it's these one-way sort of things. And the truth is that everything that we're seeing right now, to a large extent, is blowback on October 7th. And, if someone had told the Iranians, careful what you wish for, or told Hamas, like, maybe they wouldn't have done any of this stuff and we'd be in a very different place. At the same time, everyone seems to think that Trump doesn't believe in blowback, when in fact, his entire approach is terrified of blowback. That's why he kind of rules out boots on the ground. That's why he didn't do regime change in Venezuela. He just simply replaced, a recalcitrant thug with a pliant thug. And I think there's a real possibility that the Iranian strategy of screwing with the Gulf of Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz, screwing with the Emiratis and the other states, sending oil up to $150 a barrel, screwing with the stock market, gets Trump to say, "All right, I'm out," and just say, we did what we said we were going to do. That can never be a threat to us. Huge victory. I'm the greatest thing ever. And leave the regime in place. Or even, he's actually said that in one of these interviews that his model is sort of like the Venezuela model. Well, the Venezuela model is not regime change, right? And so I think things can turn on a dime in this domestic debate right now, where everybody on the left is saying he's a hypocrite for saying he doesn't want to do forever wars. The last thing in the world he's going to do deliberately is a forever war. He likes clean, antiseptic, strikes where Israel loosens the lid on the jar, and then he's the one who gets to take it off. And so I can see the Saudis and the Israelis and a lot of people getting really pissed at him by the time this podcast airs, possibly, or in a couple weeks. I have no idea.
Yeah. So I completely agree with you about every single one of those points. First, on blowback, I've worked on the Middle East for almost 40 years. There's nothing but blowback in the Middle East.
It's all blowback. Yeah.
Right, exactly. For absolutely everyone. And, everyone gets it wrong, right? It is just shocking. A number of people have actually really gotten it right. I mean, Anwar Sadat, maybe in 73. That's one of the very rare cases I can think of someone who actually got it all right. And that was almost miraculous. But otherwise, it's all blowback. Second point, I think you're absolutely right that we don't think about too often in our American debates about these issues, about the blowback elsewise. And in terms of what we're going on here now, what you've described, Jonah, is more or less what I think is going on. So again, this is Tuesday, March 3rd in the morning. This could all change. But my best sense of Trump's approach to this is he's going to bomb Iran for some period of time. Maybe days, maybe weeks. I don't think much longer than that. But he's going to bomb Iran for a certain period of time. He is going to decimate, or actually, obliterate, right? We'll use a Trumpian term. He's going to obliterate the Iranian military. He's going to do a lot of damage to Iran's internal security forces, humiliate the regime. The Israelis are going to kill a whole bunch of Iranian leaders. And then at some point, as I said, maybe in days, maybe in weeks, but probably not many weeks, if it is weeks, he's going to announce that he's done. Right. And at that point in time, I think he's going to say to the Iranian people, okay, I have now given you this historic opportunity to change your regime. Go for it. And if it succeeds and they overthrow the regime, he will take credit for it. And if they fail, he'll be able to say, listen, I gave you a once in a generation opportunity and you clearly couldn't take advantage of it. Sucks to be you. But either way, he's going home. Right. And he will be able to say, I did what I intended. I got rid of Ayatollah Khamenei. I got rid of the leadership. I destroyed Iran's military such that Iran will never be able to threaten any other country ever again. Right. And, it's a shame that the Iranian people couldn't remove their leaders, but clearly they weren't up to the job. And as for the rest of you in Tehran, still very interested in a deal. If you'd like to sit down now, we can talk. If not, 202-456-1414. Give me a call whenever you're ready to. And by the way, I might be back at some point in time and do this again to you if you're not willing to. As best I can tell, Jonah, right now, that seems to be Trump's approach to this, right? As you point, I talked about this a little bit. I hate exit strategies. I think it's absolutely the wrong way to think about wars. But that's clearly how Trump is thinking about it. He's got his exit strategy. But as you're pointing out, not at all clear how that's going to work out for the Iranian people. Not at all clear how that's going to work out for our allies in the region, right? For a lot of them, that may not be a good outcome at all.
So it's funny. They're ginning up to do a war powers resolution vote on the Hill. And for the record, I think the actual War Powers Act is kind of stupid. It was supposed to be a check on presidential power, and instead it gives him a free pass for 60 days to do whatever the hell he wants, which was not the intent. And, but there's a funny irony here is that sort of like the Supreme Court could have saved Trump from himself by just saying, okay, the tariff thing didn't work, stop doing tariffs, but he decided to do them anyway. Congress, the Democrats could give an unbelievable gift to Trump, where they vote to shut down the war before it's over. Trump says, as a lover of the Constitution, I think you're wrong. I think we need to see this through, but my hands are tied. The fate of Iran is now on your consciences. I wanted to save those people. And he pulls out. And then when the thing turns to hell, he gets to say, see what the Democrats did? They hamstrung your commander-in-chief, yada, yada, yada. Of course, Trump will not accept the idea that Congress can tell him to stop. So that scenario doesn't work. But it's a good example of how often life gives Trump these opportunities to do something in his own interest, and he can't get his head around. And maybe that won't happen, but I would be very shocked. I have to ask you all right, so there's Marco Rubio on Monday night, on his way into briefing the Gang of Eight, gave this explanation about the imminent threat.
If we stood and waited for that attack to come first before we hit them, we would suffer much higher casualties. And so the president made the very wise decision. We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties and perhaps even higher those killed. And then we would all be here answering questions about why we knew that and didn't act.
I don't know how to ask this because I have so many opinions about this and I've talked to so many people about it. Because there's a political angle, there's a factual angle. What did you think of his comments? We'll just take it from there. I don't want to lead the witness.
Yeah, I thought it was the most bizarre and convoluted explanation for a war I've ever heard in my life. And, it really makes no sense to me. I mean, I will say, let's come back to the administration's motivation in a moment. But in terms of that explanation, particularly, again, I am a student of military history, do teach it as well. The best explanations for wars tend to be the simplest and the best. That, has to be at the top of the list for kind of a bizarro explanation that makes almost no sense. And look, from my perspective, Jonah, the Iranian regime has been at war with the United States for 47 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, they declare us their enemy every day of the week. Mm-hmm. And, they actually act on it, right? I'm sure you come up with other regimes and other places who also declare us to be their enemy every day, but they don't act on it. Right? Hell, there are plenty of people in Cambridge, Massachusetts who declare war on the United States of America on a daily basis. But if they're not acting on it, it's meaningless. What we've seen from the Iranian regime is for 47 years, they have worked very, very hard to harm the United States of America and our allies and our interests, in any way that they could do so. They've killed hundreds, possibly thousands of Americans, both directly and indirectly. They've attacked our allies in any number of different ways. Being rid of that regime, is a huge strategic good for the United States. As I said, it's also a moral good. It is, what is best for the people of Iran, for our allies, etc. The case for a war against Iran writ large, I think, is there, right? I think the issue of why did we choose to go to war at this point in time in this way, that's a lot harder. I do think that the way that the Trump administration is trying to justify it is very problematic. I think ultimately the president had his reasons. I think you talk about this very persuasively and occasionally very eloquently on the Remnant all the time, that this is a personalist presidency. This is a personalist administration. It is driven by the president's personal desires, personal interests, right? And that really is the primary motivation of all of this stuff. And I think that you and I could come up with all kinds of reasons why Donald Trump at this moment in time wanted to take on this war. From my perspective, that's not an unimportant reason, but in some ways it is separate from the wider strategic rationale that is out there, which is what leaves me, you said this at the beginning of the podcast, it's complicated. Right? In terms of, was this right? Was this smart? All of those different things. I think there's a very compelling case for overthrowing the Iranian regime. Was it justified in these circumstances? Should we have done it exactly? In some ways, that is very much a separate issue. I also want to make two other points there. One, I do want to come back to this point that we've been talking about already, because it is so important that at the end of the day, while I can absolutely make the case that a war against Iran is strategically justified from the perspective of the United States, the ultimate question of whether or not we believe this war was worth fighting is going to revolve very much on this day after question of what we leave behind and whether it proves to be better or worse than what we got rid of. Right? And then the last point I wanted to make on this topic is, again, this is a perfect example of how the administration is choosing to communicate around this war, which, in some ways is very problematic. Yes, their explanations of why they're doing what they're doing are very problematic. The manner in which they're doing it is, it's so confrontational. It's so offensive in many cases, I think unnecessarily. Hegseth's press conference the other day, where he's so condescending and angry toward reporters. Just a reason to be that, right? You could do the same thing in a very different tone. It would come off very, very differently. But the last thing I wanted to say on this point is that at some level, I also have actually a great deal of sympathy for them. We live in a democracy. We expect our leaders to level with us. We want transparency as much as we can. But again, picking up on points you've made in the past, there are some institutions actually in some occasions where transparency is not what is in the best interests of the country.
Right.
And war is number one, right? Not telling the adversary what you're actually planning to do is really important. And so again, while I don't necessarily like the way that they are handling this, I have great sympathy. Yes, it'd be great. The press always wants to know, average Americans want to know, but the truth of the matter is that it's actually much better for the country right now if our adversaries don't know exactly what it is that we're trying to do, when we're going to do it, and how we're going to do it. So a certain amount of misdirection or simply kind of, remaining mute is it's not just not a bad thing on the part of this administration, it's actually a good thing. And again, it kind of rankles us and we see other things that they do that we don't like. Got to recognize in these circumstances, it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, so I take your point, and I think I agree with it. I think you'd also agree with me that part of the problem is when you haven't built a public case for what you're going to do, it is impossible not to load a lot of questions that would have been answered by the public argument, or like in this State of the Union, which was only a few days earlier, and instead you get questions about, like literally what the hell is going on questions, where if you had told America, okay, a war with Iran is coming, you wouldn't get the what the hell is going on question. But when you get a what the hell is going on question in the middle of ongoing combat operations, it touches on this transparency problem that you're talking about. But you wouldn't get those questions were it not for the fact that they didn't make a coherent public case in advance, and they keep changing the rationale for the war in real time. I'd also just note as a sort of a footnote on this, when you talk about Hegseth being obnoxious towards the press corps, he was also just incredibly obnoxious towards previous presidents and administrations and towards a lot of our allies. I mean, the dickishness was on tilt, but it's worth pointing out that most of the press corps in there, at least the American press corps, were brought in as to be lickspittle fan service outlets, like from right-wing outlets, because they kicked out, or the mainstream press corps just left because of the rules that were being imposed on them. So it just shows you, like, there is this sense that a lot of people, when they get into power, they think, well, when I'm in power, the press will be nice to me, blah, 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 blah. And it turns out that even, allegedly, subservient pro-Trump press feel compelled to ask inconvenient questions from time to time because they're the right questions to ask. I do want to come back to the Israel leg of this for just a second. I had a big long discussion about this morning with a colleague, and he was saying, I don't know why Rubio would say it unless it was true. And my response was, I don't know why Rubio would say it if it was true. And you can see both sides of it because it's so bizarre. Like, why would you say that unless it was true? Makes total sense. But also, if it's true, why in the world would you say that? And I just take it, we know from just last June that Trump can tell Israel no. And the idea that Israel would launch a war on Iran despite the express objection of the Trump administration strikes me as just sort of somewhere between unpersuasive and totally preposterous. And so the only way I think it could be somewhat conceivably true, I shouldn't say the only bit, one of the ways is Phil Klein offers another defense an hour people can take a look at, but is that this is some sort of scheme that Bibi and Trump kind of worked out where, like, look, we can say we had to do this for our own purposes and therefore, things were going to go off and you needed to be out front or something like that. But like, I just don't get like what the rationale for, because the number of people who say that we are basically Israel's pit bull and attack dog or whatever, has been getting out of hand for a while now, and this is not going to be erasable anytime soon. And Rubio is like the one guy in the administration who actually says smart things from time to time. So it's just very strange to me.
Yeah, look, I agree with you, John. I think, I think all that is absolutely spot on. Again, as you're pointing out, they've got themselves into this set of circumstances where, they're doing things for reasons that are completely contrary to things that they've said in the past and what they're trying to do. And to some extent, I think they are trying to maintain a certain amount of just kind of, darkness around the whole operation. But yeah, they've got themselves into a situation where it's really hard to explain exactly what they're doing. But I think what they're doing is much simpler. And I think, it's foolish of them to come up with these ridiculous and convoluted explanations. But that seems to be what they're doing. But, at the end of the day, I think that Trump decided, in part because Bibi was pushing him on this,
Sure,
but in part because it was just, something he was interested in. And again, he's been kind of going around the world looking for, ornaments he can hang on the Christmas tree of his second-term presidency, right? So, Nobel Peace Prize, I'm going to make peace in all these different countries. Now I'm going to take out all these different rulers. I took out Maduro. This one was, I think, very much the unfinished business of, I want to get a nuclear deal better than Obama got.
right.
And, Bibi was in there pitching, saying, they're rebuilding, they're doing all this. And by the way, Donald, they've been thumbing their nose at you. You told them to make a deal after the 6-day war. They haven't done it. Are you really going to take that? And then he gets into the negotiations. And again, while it's very clear that there was a very wide range of military options being prepared, it did seem very much that he was leaning in the direction of, I'm going to do a somewhat more limited operation that's really about creating leverage for these negotiations. But then we got the intel that said, Khamenei is going to be at this location, and right nearby is going to be this meeting of basically the heads of the security services, and the Israelis basically came in and said, we can kill them all. And we decided to go bigger, right? And again, we went bigger. But the point that I made initially is this isn't the full-on regime change option, right? I mean, if the United States were absolutely determined to bring about regime change in Iran, we could insert ground forces. Even if we didn't want to do so, again, you would be trying to mobilize ground forces from within Iran, and we would be, we'd actually have, bigger air presence, constant air presence, doing close air support to those ground operations, right? So this is a more limited form of regime change, which again makes the, Olympics are just over, right? Adds to the level of difficulty of actually pulling this thing off. And again, I want to be clear, this could work, right? We all now are love the great Ernest Hemingway line, how did you go bankrupt? In two ways, gradually, then suddenly. That's how these regimes come apart is, they look fine and dandy, and then the next minute they are just kind of coming apart at the seams. That could happen in Iran. I absolutely cannot rule it out. I would not rule it out. It's just that, again, the weight of the historical evidence suggests that it's going to be very hard to make that work in this case. And again, I relate that back to how Trump decided to get into it.
Okay, so we should do sort of lightning-ish round stuff because we're running out of time. Everyone's heard a lot about Pahlavi and how he could play a role and may or may not, and who knows, and that's fine. We've talked about that a bunch. We've talked about it with Eli Lake a bunch. What are the other groups like MEK? Like who are the groups in the diaspora and exile or underground that all of a sudden we're going to need a glossary of terms to know who they are, and what are the chances that those kinds of groups start to actually really matter, because they haven't in a long time.
So let me start with this. I would need a glossary of who they are, because truth is we just haven't been paying attention to them for decades because they've been irrelevant. And in most cases, they are small. The diaspora is also pretty fragmented in terms of these different groupings. Reza Pahlavi is Persian, and he is a figure that other Iranians know, in particular folks on the inside know. Remember, they've been living under this horrible dictatorship for 47 years that suppressed opposition groups. The only opposition groups that have been able to thrive in any meaningful way under the Islamic Republic have been these ethnically, geographically based ones. So the Kurds, to some extent, the Arabs in the Southwest, the Baluch out in the East, right? Because they have communities that they can survive in, they've been able to persist. But again, they represent their communities. There's no expectation that they could take over or become the darlings of the larger Persian population. Within Iran itself, again, very little organized opposition. What we see when every 2 or 3 years when they revolt, it's big, it's widespread, represents a huge percentage of the population, but there's no real organization there, right? Because the regime will go after any organization. And again, hard to know. We don't have good polling on Iran because it is a nasty dictatorship. But the best evidence suggests that all of these calls for Reza Pahlavi are mostly Iranians simultaneously nostalgic for the days of the Shah. And remember, very few Iranians actually were alive during the era of the Shah because it's a very, very young population. But they remember their parents and grandparents telling them how life was better under the Shah. And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is just he's the one opposition name they know. Right. There's nobody else that they know. And so to some extent, they're calling out his name just as a simple act of defiance. But I think that this is actually a moment for not just Reza Pahlavi, but the rest of the Iranian diaspora to kind of stand up. And, this is a moment when they could actually play a role. They are going to need to organize themselves. They're going to need to unify. They're going to need to come up with a unified set of ideas about what a future Iran could look like. I mean, the truth is, I think you're familiar with the Future of Iraq project that the State Department tried to organize back in 2002, 2003, before the invasion of Iraq. The truth is that the Iranian diaspora, the Iranian opposition, could really use something exactly like that right now because they don't have it. Right? They've not been in a position to implement it for 47 years. Now's their chance.
Okay, and so not to want to repeat what we were saying about how Trump could cut and run, but the other Gulf states, right? So Saudis in particular. So there was a Washington Post story that behind the scenes MBS was lobbying very hard for a more serious operation. What would it take for UAE, Qatar, whoever, to all of a sudden say, okay, this is either this is too much, Donald Trump, you have to stop this, or okay, this is too much, we're in the war too, and it really does become even more of a full-blown regional war?
Yeah. So first, let me go back to a point that you made early in the podcast, because you described the Iranian strategy exactly correct, which is that when the regime was in extremis, they were going to lash out in every possible direction simply to try to put pain on the United States, right? To get our allies, to get us to call this whole thing off. What we've seen so far actually is something of a mixed message, but more in our favor than less. So, early on, we had a whole bunch of our Gulf allies say, we're not going to let you fly missions against Iran from our soil, right? And that was them saying, we really don't want you to do this. Not good going forward. But because of the Iranian attacks on them, increasingly they're allowing us to do so. And I think that, this is another one of those miscalculations by the Iranians, another aspect of the blowback, the unintended consequences. To some extent, it's understandable. The Iranians don't have great ways to fight back against us. They're going to use everything in their arsenal to try to do so. And what we're seeing so far is that this is getting the Gulf states more on board with the war effort. Okay, now comes the big but. And it's a really important point that I was hoping to make on this, which is, as I said before, earlier on, I think the expectation was that Trump was going to do a more limited strike, really one focused on their military. not designed to bring about regime change, not kill Ayatollah Khamenei. And under those circumstances, you'd expect a bigger Iranian response than we got last time, but not a crazy Iranian response, not an all-out Iranian response, because Khamenei has very consistently recognized that the United States could overthrow his regime, and he didn't want to give us any kind of an excuse, any kind of a pretext to go ahead and do so. And so his consistent MO was, I under-respond to the Americans to avoid escalation to regime change. Well, now he's gone, and we've proclaimed that the goal is regime change. And again, as I've said, how much effort we're putting into it from an American perspective, I can say we're not making the 100% effort. It's something less than 100%. Not at all clear that the Iranians think that way. In fact, the evidence we have from the Iranian side is they do think that we're making the 100% effort.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine it feeling like that from their perspective.
Exactly, right? And that's what we've kind of said. And the problem is that we always knew that the moment that the Iranians made that calculation, their response would shift dramatically, because now there's no reason for restraint, right? Now it is, in fact, all the incentives on their part shift to, we have to do everything that we possibly can to convince the Americans to stop, right? And we do that by putting as much pain on them and their allies as we possibly can. That's why they're now shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, right? Something that for 35 years, experts on Iran have been saying this won't happen unless the regime feels that it is being threatened. And of course, that has been proven correct right up and to this day. Now the regime feels threatened. They are shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. We should think about other things that they could do. Cyber attacks here in the United States, right? They've been developing their cyber capability for 20 years. And by the way, I think everyone knows there are Iranian cyber attacks going on right now. Mm-hmm. The extent, what they, we don't know that. And we also don't know what, how big the cyber weapons they have, how damaging they could be. We know they've been trying to poke around in American infrastructure for 20 years to find holes. If they could turn off the lights in Los Angeles or turn off water sewage in Chicago, now is the time to expect them to do that. And then the last piece out there, and God, I hope that the U.S. and Israel are, going after these targets. Iran has weapons of mass destruction. They don't have nuclear weapons, but they have chemical weapons, and we know that they had a biological warfare program. I personally do not know how advanced it is at this point in time, but again, the feeling was always in extremis. That's when the regime might very well try to employ these kinds of weapons. So, could they employ them against our allies? Absolutely. Would that cause our allies to change their mind? Possibly. Or it might cause them to double down and say, just kill these bastards. But, get rid of all of them, no stopping halfway. And as I said before, that clearly is where the Saudis are. And I suspect that's actually what Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of the UAE, was also saying to President Trump. As you pointed out, we got that newspaper article. That's what I think was really there, was you need to do this and you need to do it all the way, right? Mm-hmm. Get rid of these guys. But again, we got to think about this. We've now convinced the Iranian regime we're coming for them. Their incentives for restraint are probably out the window. And as I said, the fact that they're hitting all of these different targets all across the region, right? The initial salvo of missiles from them, all U.S. bases in the region. That's what you would expect if they thought we were just going after, again, their military, their nukes, not going after regime change. Now going after ports and power plants and oil facilities and tourist destinations, right? Again, that's the target set that you associate with a regime that feels like it is against the wall. The United States is trying to strangle it, and they're just trying to lash out in every direction to get us to stop. As I said, that's where the going after the Strait of Hormuz comes in, and that's where some of these even worse options, cyber attacks here in the United States, weapons of mass destruction, that's exactly what you'd want to be guarding against, what you'd fear from the Iranians in these circumstances.
So I have a question about this. This has been bugging me. It's simultaneously important and also just airing old receipts. But tell me how to think about this. I am old enough to remember that in the 2004 and maybe even 2008 presidential elections, and the primaries for the various parties, whatever. There was a lot of talk about Hezbollah is here. I think Senator Bob Graham used to talk about them as the A team of terrorism, that they have cells here, that we should be really worried about that. I think Rick Santorum on the Republican side said stuff along those lines. I don't think they were lying. I certainly didn't think they were lying at the time. But I have heard, like, what I just described to you is the longest conversation I have heard about Hezbollah sleeper cells in the United States since this thing has kicked off. And, like, was it true then and not true now? Is it still true? If it's still true, even though these guys are now like paunchy middle-aged dudes, presumably if they're still here, the same cells, why haven't they done anything? Or will they be doing something?
Yeah. So first, we know that Iran and Hezbollah have operations in South America, right? And there have been very credible reports that they've been trying to do operations and, yes, implant agents in North America. First, obviously, anytime that our intelligence community finds out something credible, they go and try to find those people. So, imagine that a certain percentage of that information may have been true at one point in time, but then became untrue because we went and unraveled those cells. In addition, first point, I think you're absolutely right to bring this up because terrorism is another way that you could imagine the regime lashing out. It's a little bit difficult. Terrorist operations are hard to set up on the fly. Yeah, you can always just take a Kalashnikov and go down to the mall and start shooting people. But, you need to have someone who's willing to commit suicide to do that. Sometimes you get that, sometimes you don't. And, the people who are willing to commit suicide are typically not good sleeper agents, right? Those are not terribly stable people, and they typically need to be really amped up to go and do the suicide operation. So sending someone over here and saying, okay, in 10 years, we're going to tell you to go do this that's going to involve you killing yourself. Right. Really, really hard to make that happen. So again, terrorist operations are very difficult to do on the fly, at least sophisticated ones, the ones that can really do a lot of damage, hard to do on the fly. The other thing that we found about the Iranians is, as a friend of mine, an expert on terrorism, likes to point out, Iran's terrorism capability seems to be directly proportionate to distance from Tehran. The farther away they get, the more amateurish they become. And, it's worth thinking about some of the operations that we know they've tried to do here in the United States, right? So, this crazy plot back in 2013 where they decided they wanted to kill the Saudi ambassador to the United States by blowing up Cafe Milano, which is a very nice restaurant in Georgetown, right? And the way that they do it is, they go out to a bunch of, yahoos who, say, well, you want to do this? And they're like, well, we don't know how to do it. And they make contact with what they think are drug cartels to say, well, you guys can blow stuff up in the United States. Would you do it? And of course, the FBI finds out about it in a nanosecond, right? And again, so many of the Iranian efforts to commit terrorist attacks on American soil to fall into those categories where, when things like that happen, you realize, wow, these guys are either not as good as we thought, or they're just really not paying attention. They haven't built that kind of a network here in the United States. I mean, they're very good at killing people at home. They're very good at killing people around the Middle East. They're not bad at killing people in Europe too, but they do seem to be best at operating within their own neighborhood. But, again, you're absolutely right to bring it up, Jonah, because again, this is a regime that seems to believe, for very good reason, that the United States is coming to get it. And we have to expect that they're going to use every tool at their disposal to try to get us to stop.
Okay, I know we're over time, but just one last question. I listened to Jake Sullivan on TV today, and he made some fine points. He made some points I really disagree with. But he also echoed an argument. There's this tendency in moments like this, for understandable reasons, to be just black and white, right? There's this all bad or all good. And I'm way deep in the gray on all of this, and I'm sure you are too. But broadening out, I actually looked up who makes THAAD interceptors this morning because I was like, I want to invest in those guys. Call me a war profiteer if you like, but like we're just really low on THAAD interceptors, right? And which brings me back to Sullivan. He was making the point that one of the problems with this is that we're running out of weapons that we could send to Ukraine. And I'm like, that's not, I just don't think it's a great argument. I think it's true that we're running out of these weapons and we should have a lot more of them. But we're also presumably taking out the main supplier of Russia's drones in all of this, right? And so, and then on the other hand, there's a lot of hands, more hands than Vishnu on all this stuff. Like there's the making oil more expensive is good for Putin. Taking Iran off the chessboard, bad for Putin. You can go down a list on all of this kind of thing. What do you think that sort of big picture, let's say after this is over and we're doing after action kind of thing, is this on net improving the world's security posture? I mean, again, I know it depends. If it's chaos, let's agree to all about that. If it's thriving Athenian democracy, all really good. Let's say it's something in the middle. And I'm not really talking about what it's good for Iran or not. I'm talking about in terms of our military posture. Are we in much worse shape for being able to defend Taiwan? Or have we, as George Will writes this morning, have we restored deterrence on the global stage? Like, big picture, is this helping our position in the world with some downsides? Or is it hurting, but with some upsides?
Yeah, so I'll take again, in the context of that middle scenario,
right,
where it's not chaos, but it's not necessarily Athenian democracy. And by the way, that's something you could absolutely understand. You get basically a new dictator in Iran,
sure.
But not one who's viciously anti-American, viciously anti-Israeli, not looking to be the hegemon of the Middle East. In that context, in the Middle East context, that in and of itself is very much an improvement.
For sure.
Over this one. It's not as good as it could be. It's not as good as the Athenian democracy, but it's a very good outcome. Strategically, overall, so I think that, yes, I lean toward this is good for the United States. I think that this is another moment when it makes the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans recognize just how powerful the United States is, and that we have the freedom of action to employ that power. Yes, there are going to be lots of stories out there about our munitions stockpiles. From my perspective, Jonah, that's actually part of an argument for why the U.S. military needs to be better funded than it actually is. And you can talk to Mackenzie Eaglin or Michael Hanlon or experts on the defense budget about whether even Trump's plus up is the right kind of plus up and will do enough. But I think there's no question about that. But I don't think that Putin or Xi are necessarily going to make the calculation. I think the Americans only have about 500 THAADs,
right.
So therefore I'm going to invade Taiwan, or I'm going to make a big push on Ukraine. They're not going to know what our stockpile is, and they're going to assume that what we're putting out is misinformation. Right. I think the more important thing is that if they, once again, this is a demonstration of America's power, that seems to always make them think twice about things. Right. So yes, in that sense, I do actually think that it would be helpful. But again, I do think that this question of what happens in Iran and how we feel about it, right? I mean, one of the, as you know, I just wrote this massive book about the U.S. and Iraq. And, one of the many bad outcomes from the Iraq War was how it made Americans unwilling and uninterested in using force in all these different places that were completely different from Iraq and that we would have handled completely different from Iraq. But, if we come away from this once again feeling like, boy, every time we use force, it turns out really badly for us, that's not going to help our deterrent around the world.
All right, my friend, I can do this all day, and love to talk to you when the book actually comes out about the book. I mean, I would love to do maybe not a whole episode, but a big chunk of an episode on how's Iraq doing, because it kind of feels like no news is good news when it comes to Iraq. And always welcome to come back one of these days we're going to hash it out about Royal Navy history, but today's not that day. Thank you once again, Ken Pollack.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jonah. It is always such a pleasure to be on the Remnant with you.
All right, Ken Pollack has left the studio. I could hit you with all sorts of deep thoughts about all of this and reactions and stuff, but we're going to do a dispatch podcast later this week, and I'm sure it's going to be all about Iran, and the events are going to change between now and then. And then there's the Remnant, where I'm going to talk about all this again. So let me just say, I always think it's great to have Ken on. I'll be looking in the comments or in the responses from folks for things you wish I had brought up with him, so that I can think about like other issues, that kind of stuff. So let me know. And other than that, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.